Welcome to our class on the book of Hebrews. Today, we are going to be going through an introduction to this book. And I know, like when I was in college or just anytime I started a new class, I would think, we have to sit through the introduction. But I hope this introduction will be interesting for you and that it will be helpful to you as we move through this wonderful book of Hebrews. So let's get started and talk about maybe why we study Hebrews. The lessons in Hebrews are applicable to our lives today. They are helpful even today, even though they were written centuries ago. These words are helpful to us today. Now let's go back in time and look at what was happening at that time in history. It was written at a time when everything seemed uncertain, confusing, even frightening. Actually, today, a lot of people are confused. They're feeling uncertain. They watch the news, or you may watch the news, and you feel frightened about the future. And that's what was happening with the Hebrews, minus the TV, of course. But the news they were getting, the things that were happening, it was confusing to them as Christians. And it was scary. The Greeks, who had been so influential, were losing their intellectual influence on the world. Rome was still in power. And of course, they were ruling the world with their military. But the political unrest was widespread, and it just seemed to be there seemed to be more unrest at this time politically, with the Senate, with the government. What about Judaism? Well, it was still tolerated by Rome, but it was a thorn in their side. Jewish zealots were taking their stand by now. Zealots, if you don't know, were defenders of the national life of the Jewish people. But they did it through physical fighting. And they had begun their revolt against the Roman government. What about Christianity? Well, from the beginning, Jews had persecuted the Christians. But Christians were also becoming scapegoats for the Romans. Anytime a problem came up, well, let's just blame it on the Christians. They were using propaganda to influence the public against Christians and their way of life. This happens, we can see this all throughout history. Remember, Hitler used propaganda against the Jews. And even today, there's propaganda being put on the news that is just, it's not true. And you don't even know who to believe. You watch one newscast on one station and they say this, and another station says this. What do you believe? Who do you believe? Who is true and who is not? So it was time of upheaval. Intellectual upheaval, social upheaval, economic upheaval, religious upheaval, as well as political. So this sounds very familiar. We have no idea what our economy is going to look like within the next year. In fact, today, biblical authority is being belittled by politicians, by the media. Life's just that way, isn't it? It's never easy. As I was going through, well, my mom taught Hebrews back in 2008 here at Shiloh. And so I thought, okay, well, what was going on in 2008? Well, if you will recall, it was a presidential election year. She began it in the fall, in October of that year. And I don't know if you remember who was running for president, but it was Obama against McCain. And there was a lot of political unrest then, a lot of uncertainty. So it's an ongoing thing, this uncertainty with our lives. Those of you who have heard Gary's sermon from last week, he was talking about the Saturday between the Friday of Christ's death and the Sunday of Christ's resurrection. And he was saying that that was a time of fear. It was a time of uncertainty. It was a time of waiting on God, putting your faith in God, because everything you thought was going to happen didn't happen. Everything the disciples knew was going to happen, it just did not happen the way they had pictured it in their minds. So they may have had some doubt. They may have had a lot of fear, wondering what, if anything, would come next. Hebrews is about waiting. It's like that Saturday in between that Friday and the Sunday. It's waiting on God. It's not being afraid of what the future looks like. It's not having your faith be a doubting faith. It's not being afraid of the next step. But that's what was happening during this time. We are still today in a state of waiting. What does our future look like? What does our children's future look like? Is our faith strong enough to endure what that future holds? And what is our next step? So Hebrews has something to say to us. It, of course, has something to say to those in the past, and it also will have something to say to those in the future. Continuing on, let's talk about the time and the place of the writing. Your question number 1, according to the history of the Roman Empire, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus in AD 70. What physical evidence is given in Hebrews 9, verse 25, 10, verse 11, and 13, verse 1 that could provide a clue as to when Hebrews was written? So let's just look at these scriptures. Hebrews 9, 24 through 25. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood that is not his own. Notice enters. That's present tense. Go over to Hebrews 10, verse 11. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Okay? Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. Okay, so those verbs were in the present tense. And then 13, verse 11. The high priest carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering. Again, those are examples that use the present tense, which, may indicate that this book was written before AD 70 because, Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed in AD 70. Now, I thought this was fairly obvious to me, but as I read commentaries, I thought, wow, they don't seem to think about this. So some of them did, but quite a few of the commentators did not agree with this. Several of them were of the opinion that it was written between the persecutions, because Hebrews talks about the persecutions that they had already endured, and then he talked about enduring another persecution in the future. So they feel like it was between persecutions. Now, the first persecution was during the time of Nero. Now, Nero was in power between 64 AD and 70 AD. Then the second persecution was during the time of Domitian, and he was in power between AD 81, and 96. So some people felt like it was maybe before AD 70, and a lot of them felt like it was more around 84 AD, when Domitian first took power, and then later on the persecution started. I don't know. And they don't know. It's just something you don't know for a fact. But in Hebrews 13, verse 7, the Hebrew writer indicates that their leaders, probably the apostles, had died for their faith, and other leaders as well. Hebrews 12, verse 4 and 13, verse 3 indicates that the people he's writing to had been under persecution, but they had not resisted persecution to the point of shedding their blood. And also, they knew many who were in prison and or were being mistreated. Hebrews 12, verse 7 talks about God's discipline and how they needed to prepare themselves for possible persecution. All right, let's move on to question 2. This is from where was from where was it written? Now we see in Hebrews 13, verse 24, those from Italy send you their greetings. Now, several scholars thought, okay, it says he was writing from Italy. And then again, quite a few commentators said, no, wait. This is not talking about him writing from Italy. It's referring to, it's passing on greetings to his audience from those with him who are from Italy. I know that might have sounded confusing, but probably friends of his audience, the recipients, who were traveling from Italy and who were visiting this author. It's sort of like if we had a group of people here from Shiloh that went to another country and maybe we're working over there, or maybe even when your child goes off to college and a bunch of people from Shiloh went to, say, ACU or Harding, they would write back and say, hey, everybody from Shiloh says hey. That's the way these commentators were thinking it is. But again, we don't know for sure. So, yet another thing that we don't know for sure of. All right, well, what about the author, the writer? Do we know for sure who that is? No. sorry, no one knows for sure who the author is because he did not announce himself. Now, there are people who think it was Paul, but Paul always announced himself. One commentator said it's possible that the salutation was just lost, and that's possible. But it's not there, so we don't know for sure. Some people have thought it was Barnabas. The Hebrew letter has a lot of encouragement in it to its audience. And Barnabas is called the son of encouragement. So it's possible that it was Barnabas. We just really don't know. Even as far back as the 4th century, the author was not known. You know, that was just 200 or 300 years after the writing of Hebrews, probably. So, but we do know some things about him. He was a great teacher. He was very eloquent in his writings. It seems like he may have been a Greek orator, like Demosthenes. One of the commentators, Barclay, says the first 3 verses of Hebrews are said to be the most sonorous piece of Greek in the whole New Testament. Now, I looked up the word sonorous for you and for me. It means resonant, rich, deep, full-bodied, and vibrant. So it seems that at that time, there was a habit that the Greek orators had a habit of weaving deep, vibrant words into the first paragraph of a speech. And that is why it is thought that this person was a Greek orator, because of the first paragraph. Barclay goes on to say, so it is probably that the writer had been trained in Greek oratory. He may have felt, since he was going to speak about the supreme revelation of God to men, he should clothe his thought in the noblest language possible. And the noblest language of the day was Greek. Regardless, if God had thought it was important enough for us to know who the writer was, then we would know, wouldn't we? He would have made it completely clear. Maybe, though, we were meant to focus on the message, not the man. I found out something else interesting. Hebrews was not even added to the New Testament until the middle of the 4th century, mainly because the authorship could not be verified. So that was an important prerequisite for a book to get into the New Testament. But this book was so important, and it answered so many questions, that they added it anyway. There was a scholar, his name was Origen, from the 4th century, and he said, only God knows who wrote Hebrews. To us, the author must remain a voice and nothing more. But this voice needed to be heard, didn't it? The message was so accurate, so important, that it had to be recognized as a New Testament book. So, Barclay states also, we can be thankful to God for the work of this great, nameless one who wrote with incomparable skill and beauty about the Jesus who is the way to reality and the way to God. All right. Your question number 3, what clues do we find in Hebrews 1 verse 1, 2 verse 3, and 10 verses 32 to 34 as for whom Hebrews was written? So we're going to talk about the recipients right now. So Hebrews 1:1. Let's just go to Hebrews 1, verse 1. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. So he uses this word our, indicating that he is probably Jewish and his audience is probably Jewish. Does that mean that it wasn't to the Gentile Christians? No, they would have the benefit of that. But we will get into a little bit later why it's mainly to the Jewish Christians. Now, they were also second-generation Christians. Christians that had been converted by people who knew Christ or converted by people who knew the apostles. Chapter 2, verse 3. Let's look at that. Let's see. I'll start at this salvation. This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. Was confirmed to us by those who heard him, indicating that probably the author was converted by someone other than an apostle, a second-generation Christian, and his audience was as well. Now, the words us and our, it may indicate that he is not known for certain, as is nothing, evidently, from so far. All right. He could have been talking to a scholarly group, maybe a small body of like-minded people who had been maybe even under his instruction at one time, since he was a great teacher. They may have been preparing themselves to teach. We have schools here that all over the world that teach people how to teach. And they could have been preparing themselves for this. Chapter 5, verse 12 says, though by this time you ought to be teachers. You ought to be teachers already. But you need someone now to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. So this sort of makes me think that maybe they had been at least studying to become teachers. And they had to have a knowledge of the Old Testament. To understand everything that Hebrews talks about, you need to have a knowledge of the Old Testament and those ways of worship. It was one commentator thought that maybe the writer was a teacher who was perhaps separated from his students at one time, and then now he's concerned that they're starting to drift away without him being there. I don't know, but it's a thought. They were persecuted for their faith. Hebrews 10 verses 32 through 34. The recipients had already stood their ground in the face of suffering. They had already been publicly exposed to insult. They had stood beside others who were ill-treated. They had suffered along with those who were imprisoned. They had lost lands and possessions themselves. And they had struggled already, almost to the point of shedding blood, but not yet. Your question number 4, what real danger, did the recipients of Hebrews face? And I ask you to look in chapter 10, verses 26 through 27. They were in danger of falling away. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 through 27. If we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of the truth, No sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and of raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. Okay, so there are some danger signals. Question number 5. What clues do we find in Hebrews 2 verse 1, 3 verses 7 and 8, 6 verse 12, 10 verse 25 and 35, and then chapter 12 verse 25 as to the spiritual health of those to whom this epistle was written? All right, well, let's look at these. Let's look at these danger signals that we're talking about. All right, 2 verse 1. I'm not going to read these right now because I know you already have read them. We're just going to talk about these dangers. 2 verse 1, he talks about the danger of drifting. You know, we are going to read them. I think we've got plenty of time to do that. Hebrews 2 verse 1, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. And he's including himself in there. We have to be careful to not drift. When we talked about Acts, the very last couple of lessons, those are actually on YouTube, because I taught those. The pandemic had just started, and I had taught those to finish up Acts. But it talks about drifting and the dangers of drifting. And Hebrews talks about that a lot as well. Let's move on to chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. So, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the wilderness. So, don't harden your hearts. Once we start drifting, our hearts start to become a little harder every day. We have to guard against that. Chapter 6, verse 12. We do not want you to become lazy. Don't become lazy. We want you to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. Can we get lazy? Sure we can. We can get lazy today. John would have called that being lukewarm, not making spiritual progress. They needed, remember, to leave elementary school and move on. It's time to grow up spiritually. 10 verse 25. Get over there. Not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. So, giving up meeting together. Now, we have experience with that, don't we? We know what that's like, not being able to meet together. We spent almost a whole year not being able to meet together, to be able to give each other a hug or a handshake, or have a nice conversation with a brother and sister. We had to do it online, which is better than not being able to meet at all. But I know some of us were really needing that contact. Go on down to verse 35 of chapter 10. So do not throw away your confidence. Losing your confidence, don't throw that away. Keep it fueled. And then 12, verse 25. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. Refusal to hear the word. When you get so far gone, when you've drifted so far away, you refuse to hear the word. And that is frightening because there's that danger. Verse 26, at that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. So the world will be shaken, and we want to be with God. So these Hebrew Christians were being asked to remember what they'd been taught, to evaluate it, to examine it, re-examine it. They were being asked to endure. And they were being encouraged, and they were being asked to encourage others. So let's not ourselves get in this situation. We cannot stand still spiritually, just like they could not stand still spiritually. You have to either continue moving forward, or we will slip back. If we're not moving forward, we're slipping back. You cannot stand still, because the world doesn't stand still, does it? The time goes on, and we have to go on studying. We have to keep the Word in front of us all the time. So the lessons they needed to learn then will surely benefit us also. All right. Now, I know that I told you that we cannot pinpoint the exact time or even year that the Hebrew writer wrote Hebrews. But I'm going to ask you to use your imagination, and we are just going to pick a date before AD 70. I just want to take you back to Jerusalem. Maybe that book had reached Jerusalem at that time. Try to get into the mindset of a Jewish Christian who may have lived when this book was written. Okay. Imagine, if you will, you live in one of these houses on the slopes of Mount Zion in Jerusalem with your husband and your children. Both you and your husband are Jews by birth, but both of you were teenagers when your parents learned of the way as taught by Jesus of Nazareth and his apostles. Your house overlooks the Temple Mount, where Jews continue, even today, remember we're in AD 68, to follow the teachings of the Old Covenant. And each morning, as you step out into your yard, you can see smoke rising from the temple courts where the morning burnt offering has been sacrificed by the priests. You remember, as a very young child, walking up the temple steps with your Jewish parents, going in through the double gate and ascending up the steps to the courtyard, because your father was taking the lamb to be sacrificed on the altar. You remember also the great beauty of the temple that Herod had built. Perhaps it was not as grand as Solomon's was, but it was impressive nonetheless. You recall your first Day of Atonement. How beautifully the high priest was dressed. You can still see him in your mind's eye as he went into the temple with the blood of the lamb. And all the people held their breath, knowing that if he did something wrong in the most holy place, he could be struck dead. Your father explained to you why they put a cord on the ankle of the high priest. So if he did not come out, they could pull his body out of the most holy place. You also remember that chills ran down your spine as he came out and laid his hands on the scapegoat that was then led out into the wilderness, signifying the taking away of the sins of the people. Those were exciting times in your childhood memories. Just this morning, you and your husband were talking about what it was like back then. The beauty of the ceremonies, the sound of the trumpets and the harps, the beauty of the music as the singers sang. It was something to look forward to 3 times a year. The Christian way is so simple. None of the pomp, ceremony, and celebration you knew as a child in the Jewish religion. And so many of the way who are zealous for Christ are being brought before the courts of both the Jews and the Romans and accused of treason and insurrection. Now you are fearful of even going past the pool of Bethesda anymore because you have to go near the Lion's Gate. That's the pool where you heard that Jesus healed the cripple. You didn't see that miracle, but you've been told about it many times. But you do remember the day the great persecution began, and Stephen was taken out that gate to the north of the temple and was stoned by the Grecian Jews who were so angry because of what Stephen said to them. Many call that gate Stephen's Gate now, but the Jews and Romans still call it the Lion's Gate because of the carvings on each side. Here are the carvings right here. And speaking of persecution, just last week, friends of your parents were thrown into prison, their home and all their possessions confiscated. No one knows what is to become of them. It is a fearful time for Christians. But those same temple steps you walked up with your parents when you were a small child are the same steps from which Peter preached the first gospel sermon 38 years ago, the day your parents were baptized, along with 3,000 other Jews and proselytes. When you look out across the temple from your house, you can still see the fortress of Antonia, where Pilate washed his hands as they took Jesus away to be crucified. You've been told that the marks the soldiers carved in the pavement on the stone floor of the fortress where they played the king's game and cast lot for Jesus' garments are still there. When you go into town to visit the shops along what is now called the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Blood, you see markings made by those who were there that day when Jesus carried his own cross until he fell beneath the weight of it. The Romans still put criminals to death on that hill called Golgotha that looks so much like a skull. Standing here looking at that hill, you begin to think. Nearby is the tomb I've been told was the place where they laid the body of Jesus. I've never actually been there, but I've heard that it is in a beautiful garden owned by a rich man. Yes, I do believe all those things I have been taught by my parents and those who continued to share the good news with the people after the apostles were either put to death or left Jerusalem. I must admit, I have had doubts. But 3 weeks ago, the leaders of our congregation started reading a letter they had received that was written by someone who seems to understand our situation. The letter is very encouraging. It proves without a doubt that Jesus is superior to the angels, superior to Moses and the prophets, even the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've been told that it also helps us understand that Christianity is much superior to Judaism or any other religion, like the ones the Romans and the Greeks follow. But the best thing about what my husband and I are hearing is that it is beginning to erase the doubts we've been having and gives us the confidence we need that God is in control, no matter what. I must say also that I wonder about other Hebrew Christians who live far away from all the reminders we have about Jesus here in the city of Jerusalem. I wonder how they feel when they remember the beautiful, inspiring rituals in the temple. I do hope they get a copy of the letter, and I hope they read it and are encouraged like we have been. Well, thanks for going on that little tour with me down, just thinking about what it might have been like back then. Now, I want to go on to the message of Hebrews. We're going to look at some key words. Question number 6, what word is found in Hebrews 3 verse 6, 4 verse 16, 10, 19 through 22, 10, 35, and 13 verse 6 that indicates a specific message to be found in this book? And that word is confidence. 5 times this appears. God is in control, and he wants, in verse 6, 3 verse 6, he wants to remove all doubt of his power. 4 verse 16, he wants me to trust in his mercy and grace. Chapter 10 verses 19 through 22, he wants to remind me of my relationship with him provided by the blood of Jesus. 10 verse 35, he wants me to know my reward is secure. 13 verse 6, he wants me to feel assured of my salvation. There are other words that we find several times in this book of Hebrews. The word encourage is found 3 times. 3 verse 13, 10 verse 25, and 12 verse 5. The words eternal and forever, or eternal or forever, are found 10 times. Now, I'm going to give you these because I know some of you like to write them down. 1 verse 8, 5 verse 6, 5 verse 9, 6 verse 2, 6 verse 20, 7 verse 17, 7 verse 21, 9 verse 12, 9 verse 14, and 9 verse 15. All right. Also, the word perfect occurs 11 times. So let me give you those. 2 verse 10, 5 verse 9, 7 verse 11, 7 verse 19, 7 verse 28, 9 verse 11, 10 verse 1, 10 verse 14, 11 verse 40, 12 verse 2, and 12 verse 23. And lastly, we have the words better, superior, and greater. One of these words is found at least 13 times in the book of Hebrews. Are you ready? Here we go. 1 verse 4, 6 verse 16, 7 verse 7, 7 verse 19, 7 verse 7 verse 22, 8 verse 6, 9 verse 23, 10 verse 34, 11 verse 4, 11 verse 16, 11 verse 35, 11 verse 40, lots of them in 11, and then 12 verse 24. Okay, I want to look at a quick outline of Hebrews, and then we will be done for the day. We will be seeing that the Hebrew author is going to prove that Jesus is a superior being. He's superior to the patriarchs and the prophets. He's superior to the angels and to Moses. And he is superior to the Aaronic priests, Aaron, the Aaronic priests, and the Old Testament sacrifices. This we will find in chapters 1 through 6. Hebrews will also show Christianity to be a better religion, superior religion. And we will find this in chapters 7 through 10. And faith. He will show that faith is a better principle. It's superior. Again, it's a superior principle. That's in chapters 11 through 13. And our theme overall is God is in control. God is in control. He asks us to trust him, not to waver, not to drift, but to trust. So do that today. Do that this week. Trust in God. because you know God is in control. Thank you. See you next week.